The 1960s looked colorful and innocent on TV, but hidden inside those Saturday morning cartoons were plots, jokes, and stereotypes that would get shut down in seconds today. Imagine networks airing shows where superheroes popped pills, presidents fought aliens, and ethnic caricatures passed as comedy. Hard to picture? Well, it happened. And these shows weren't small. Kids loved them. So, which bizarre, controversial, or flat-out shocking 60s cartoons would never survive now? Let's dive in. The Dick Tracy Show, 1961 to 62. Dick Tracy was already a pulp comic legend, a hard-nosed detective who tackled the mob with his square jaw and iconic fedora. But when he jumped into Saturday morning TV, the result was a cartoon so tone-deaf, it almost feels like parody. The series barely featured Tracy himself. He sent bumbling assistants to fight his famous villains. The problem? Each villain was reimagined as a grotesque stereotype of an entire culture. Pruneface, Stoogeviller, Mumbles, all exaggerated. But then came characters like Joe Jitsu, a supposed martial arts expert who spoke in broken English and apologized after every punch. Or Go Gomez, a comic relief sidekick who was a lazy caricature of a Mexican stereotype. For kids in 1961, these antics were seen as light comedy. For adults looking back, it's jaw-dropping. This wasn't just crime fighting with slapstick. It was serving stereotypes as Saturday morning entertainment. Networks ran it without blinking, and it became a surprising hit. The irony? Dick Tracy, the straight-laced detective, was pushed to the background of his own show, almost like the producers knew he wasn't the fun part anymore. Why would it be banned today? Simple. The heavy reliance on racial caricatures would not survive modern broadcasting. The show is a relic of a time when cartoons equated funny voices and cultural cliches with children's comedy. Looking back, it's less a crime story and more of a time capsule of what American TV thought was acceptable. And trust me, it hasn't aged well. Johnny Cypher in Dimension Zero, 1967 to 68. Johnny Cypher sounds like a superhero comic you'd find in a dusty box at a flea market, but it was a real Saturday morning cartoon. The premise? A scientist gains cosmic powers and can shrink down to explore microscopic dimensions, or blow himself up to giant size to fight galactic monsters. That may sound like classic sci-fi fun, but here's where it gets wild. The show leaned heavily into violent energy blasts, screaming alien villains, and endless cosmic battles that felt more like a fever dream than Saturday morning fun. The visuals were cheap, repetitive, and oddly unsettling. Whole episodes consisted of Johnny vaporizing alien armies with beams of light, while background characters screamed in terror. Unlike other superhero cartoons that toned down the violence for kids, Johnny Cypher didn't pull punches. He was a scientist turned executioner, solving problems by annihilating them. Parents in the 1960s didn't complain much because, frankly, cartoons weren't taken seriously. But by today's standards, this would set off alarms instantly. Imagine showing grade schoolers a hero who takes drugs, power potions, to fuel laser blasting rampages. Modern networks would reject it outright for being too intense, too violent, and too psychedelic. Looking back, Johnny Cypher feels like a forgotten experiment, a bridge between innocent space cartoons and the darker, more action-heavy anime that came later. But would it air now? Not a chance. It's simply too much chaos for today's Saturday morning crowd. Mighty Heroes, 1966 to 67. On paper, the Mighty Heroes sounds like a harmless spoof. You've got Rope Man, Strong Man, Tornado Man, Cuckoo Man, and Diaper Man, the least threatening group of heroes imaginable. But here's the twist. Their battles were pure slapstick destruction. Every episode was chaos on repeat. Buildings leveled, towns torn apart, and the so-called heroes causing more damage than the villains they were supposed to stop. For kids in the 60s, this was hilarious. Heroes tripping, bashing into each other, tangling themselves in ropes, and creating endless explosions. The villains? Often unnecessary. The fun was watching superheroes destroy everything in sight under the guise of saving the day. But for modern audiences, this brand of reckless slapstick feels like dangerous messaging. Today's parents would ask, why are kids watching supposed role models encourage incompetence, destruction, and absurd violence without consequence? It wasn't just the chaos either. Diaper Man was literally a baby in a diaper wielding a giant bottle as a weapon. A baby superhero leading a team of bumbling adults sounds like the kind of bizarre pitch that would get laughed out of Hollywood today. Yet, in 1966, it was greenlit and broadcast to millions. Would it survive now? Probably not. Between the over-the-top violence, reckless humor, and questionable baby-as-leader premise, the mighty heroes would land on every watchdog group's banned list. Still, it's a fascinating reminder of how experimental cartoons could be in the 60s, long before parents had the power of social media to complain. Tom Slick, 1967-70. Created by Jay Ward, the same mastermind behind Rocky and Bullwinkle, Tom Slick looked like a quirky racing comedy at first glance. Tom was a daredevil race car driver with his gadget-packed car, the Thunderbolt grease slapper, and a can-do attitude. But here's the issue. Nearly every episode revolved around cheating, sabotage, and over-the-top crashes. Explosions, fiery wrecks, and dangerous stunts were played for laughs, and somehow kids were supposed to learn. What exactly? That reckless driving was cool? Even more eyebrow-raising, Tom's main rival, Baron Otto Matic, was a straight-up cartoon villain who tried to destroy him at every opportunity, often with life-threatening traps. And Tom? He was so absurdly cheerful, he just smiled through sabotage and explosions, like being nearly killed in a fiery wreck was no big deal. The show worked because kids loved mayhem, but parents today would lose their minds watching a Saturday morning cartoon, glorify reckless driving, unsafe stunts, and endless vehicle pileups. Imagine the outcry if a kids' show in 2025 featured constant car crashes as entertainment. It would get yanked after one episode. Yet Tom Slick still has a strange charm. It's peak Jay Ward, satirical, silly, and subversive. But in the modern world, with road safety campaigns and watchdog groups waiting to pounce, Tom Slick would never make it past the drawing board. Go Gophers, 1966-69. Here's one that makes modern viewers do a double take. Go Gophers was set in the American Old West and followed two Native American gophers constantly outsmarting bumbling U.S. cavalry officers. On the surface, you might think, hey, underdogs beating corrupt authority. What's the problem? But the execution was riddled with stereotypes. The gophers spoke in broken English, acted as tricksters, and leaned on caricatures of Native American speech and behavior. Back then, audiences laughed it off as goofy fun. The cavalry officers were idiots, the gophers always won, and the slapstick kept it light. But in hindsight, it's an uncomfortable watch. A show using native stereotypes as comic relief while dressing them as gophers feels almost unthinkable now. It wasn't malicious by 1960s standards. This was still the era of Western spoofs, but it underlined how little sensitivity there was to how marginalized groups were portrayed. The result? A show that's hard to revisit. Yes, the underdogs win. Yes, the authority is shown as incompetent. But the delivery, funny voices, exaggerated mannerisms, broad stereotypes, is why Go Gophers would be banned in a heartbeat today. Looking back, it's both a curiosity and a cautionary tale. The 1960s tried to mix slapstick and social commentary, but without modern awareness, the results veered into offensive territory. For today's audience, Go Gophers isn't just dated. It's a reminder of how far cartoons have had to evolve. King Leonardo and his short subjects, 1960-63. Before Hanna-Barbera took over Saturday mornings, Total Television tried to grab attention with King Leonardo and his short subjects. On the surface, it looked innocent enough, talking animals in a kingdom where King Leonardo the lion reigned with help from Odie Cologne the skunk. But here's the catch. Instead of being cute or educational, the show leaned heavily on mafia caricatures, political digs, and Cold War undertones that no one would dare slip into a kid's cartoon today. Take the villains, for example. Biggie Rat and Itchy Brother were styled after classic gangster stereotypes. They didn't just steal or cheat, they spoke in mob lingo and hatched elaborate underworld plots. You were basically giving kids a crash course in organized crime. Add in Odie Cologne's ridiculous accent, clearly meant to parody European sophistication, and the satire got even messier. And then there's the Cold War flavor. Episodes often centered around trickery, spies, and foreign threats, thinly disguised as comic animals. For kids, this was just wacky cartoon chaos. For adults now, it's clear the show was lampooning real political tensions. Can you imagine a network in 2025 greenlighting a kids' cartoon filled with mafia parodies and Cold War metaphors? It'd be canceled before the pilot even aired. Looking back, King Leonardo feels like a time capsule from an era when satire bled into children's entertainment without warning labels. Clever in parts, but far too politically loaded for a modern Saturday morning slot. Batfink, 1966 to 67. Batfink was meant to be a parody of Batman, and on paper that sounds brilliant. A superhero bat with wings of steel and sonar powers fighting bizarre villains. Comedy gold, right? Except the execution turned out strange, violent, and sometimes just plain unsettling. For starters, Batfink's enemies weren't lighthearted tricksters. They were grotesque caricatures like Hugo Agogo, a manic scientist who literally built torture machines. Episodes frequently ended with Batfink trapped in bizarre death contraptions before blasting his way out with his supersonic sonar. The violence was always cartoonish, but the imagery leaned closer to nightmare fuel than slapstick comedy. Then there were the cultural caricatures sprinkled throughout. Batfink encountered villains designed around exaggerated stereotypes, complete with heavy accents and mannerisms that make you cringe today. What was marketed as a superhero spoof often dipped into outright offensive portrayals. The pacing didn't help either. Episodes were short, but they crammed in so many gags that the constant explosions, fights, and chase scenes turned the show into one long, chaotic reel. For 1960s kids, it was fast and funny. For today's viewers, it feels jarring and more than a little questionable. Batfink is remembered fondly by some for its campy style, but it's also one of those series that would hit a brick wall in modern broadcasting. Between the strange villain designs, violent overtones, and dated caricatures, it's a parody that doesn't land anymore. Roger Ramjet, 1965 to 69. What if Captain America was a bumbling cartoon hero who powered up by popping pills? That's Roger Ramjet in a nutshell. A square-jawed patriot who fought no goodniks with the help of his American Eagles squad. Roger was supposed to be a satire of superhero bravado. But here's the kicker. His power source was a capsule called a proton energy pill, which gave him super strength for exactly 20 seconds. In the 60s, this was played strictly for laughs. The gag was that Roger always had to time his battles around his short power bursts. But watch it now, and the drug imagery leaps off the screen. The idea of a kid's superhero relying on pill popping to save the day? No modern broadcaster would touch it. The satire didn't stop there. Roger Ramjet leaned into Cold War patriotism, cartoon violence, and military-style heroics. Villains were exaggerated foreign stereotypes, and the jokes came fast, loud, and often politically pointed. For grown-ups who caught the references, it was sly commentary. For kids, it was just a goofy superhero smacking bad guys. Today, watchdog groups would pounce. The pill metaphor, the political digs, the constant slapstick violence, it's a checklist of red flags for modern networks. Yet in its time, Roger Ramjet carved out a cult following for being so different from the polished Hanna-Barbera lineup. Looking back, though, it's less clever satire and more, how did they get away with this? Super President 1967 to 68. Yes, you heard that right. There was actually a Saturday morning cartoon called Super President. The concept: the President of the United States secretly had superpowers. He could stretch his body, become invisible, and shoot energy beams while running the country. If that sounds like the wildest pitch you've ever heard, that's because it was. The show wasn't subtle about mixing politics and superheroics. Each episode had President James Norcross battling alien invaders, mad scientists, or natural disasters, all while still managing his role as commander-in-chief. The message was clear. America's leader wasn't just the most powerful man in politics. He was literally superhuman. Imagine this airing today. Networks would be bombarded with complaints of propaganda, political bias, and inappropriate messaging for kids. Mixing the presidency with superhero fantasy doesn't just feel strange now, it feels reckless. No matter which side of the aisle you're on, no one wants their kids' cartoons preaching about leaders as flawless gods. Super President only lasted one season, but it remains infamous as one of the strangest misfires of the 60s. Too political, too bizarre, and way too on the nose. In hindsight, it's more parody material than actual children's entertainment. And yes, it would absolutely be banned in a heartbeat today. The Beagles, 1966 to 67. If you think the title sounds suspiciously familiar, you're right. The Beagles was an animated knockoff of the Beatles, following a dog duo named Stringer and Tubby, who played in a band and got into wacky adventures. But the show wasn't just about silly dog musicians. It was drenched in psychedelic visuals, swinging 60s culture, and tongue-in-cheek references that hinted at the wild world of rock stardom. Episodes leaned into surreal imagery, bright colors, and trippy humor that mirrored the counterculture of the era. Kids probably just thought it was silly, but adults watching could catch the sly nods to real, rock and roll lifestyles. There's another issue: copyright. The Beatles themselves had no involvement, and the show was clearly borrowing their fame and likeness. In today's world of lawsuits and IP protection, that alone would sink it. But beyond the legalities, the surreal humor and implied references to altered states would have watchdog groups clutching their pearls. The Beagles barely lasted a year before fading into obscurity. But it stands as one of those only in the 60s experiments, a blatant riff on a cultural phenomenon, delivered through surreal comedy that would never clear today's standards. In hindsight, it feels like both a parody and a cash grab. Either way, it's one more 60s cartoon that would be banned before it even hit air. Space Angel, 1962 to 64. Space Angel looked like just another sci-fi cartoon in the tradition of Flash Gordon, starships, ray guns, and cosmic exploration. But the real feature wasn't the plot. It was the animation style. The show used something called synchrovox, which meant real actors' mouths were superimposed over still cartoon faces. The result? Characters with frozen expressions and creepy hyper-real lips flapping away like something from a midnight horror reel. The visuals alone would get this banned from kids' TV today. Add in the heavy Cold War flavor, plots about space stations under attack, alien conspiracies clearly modeled after enemy nations, and militaristic overtones, and it becomes obvious why Space Angel would never survive now. Kids in the 60s tolerated the awkward visuals because space adventures were still novel, but to a modern child, this would look terrifying, not entertaining. Imagine SpongeBob with human lips slapped over his face. That's the exact level of uncanny nightmare Space Angel served as its default, and don't forget the tone. Unlike the slapstick of Looney Tunes, Space Angel leaned into suspense and high-stakes drama, with gunfights and explosions as the weekly norm. To 60s kids, it was thrilling. To today's viewers, it's one big red flag: unsettling animation paired with warlike themes. If a network pitched this today, it would be rejected instantly for style, content, and sheer weirdness. Space Angel is proof that the 1960s could make a show so strange, it's almost unwatchable now. Calvin and the Colonel, 1961 to 62. Now, here's a show that proves how far we've come. Calvin and the Colonel was basically Amos and Andy in disguise, reimagined with talking animals. The two main characters, a fox and a bear, spoke and acted in ways that directly mirrored the mannerisms of black characters from the original radio and TV show. The reason? The cartoon was created after the Amos and Andy TV series was pulled for its offensive stereotypes, and producers tried to slip the same humor back onto screens, just with animals instead of humans. It's astonishing to think this even got made. The characters' exaggerated voices and Bumbling antics carried the same undertones that had already been criticized in live-action form. The solution was simply dressing the stereotypes up in fur and calling it a cartoon. Audiences at the time didn't flock to it, and the show fizzled out quickly. But the fact that it even aired is shocking by modern standards. Today, there's no way a network would even entertain the pitch, let alone broadcast it to millions of kids. Looking back, Calvin and the Colonel isn't just a cartoon, it's a historical reminder of how deeply ingrained stereotypes were in pop culture. And it's exactly the kind of innocent-looking show that would be banned in seconds today. Cool McCool, 1966 to 67. Picture a bumbling secret agent with a trench coat, a squiggly mustache, and an endless supply of gadgets that always malfunction. That's Cool McCool, an animated spy parody that tried to ride the James Bond wave. On paper, it sounds harmless. In execution, it was chaos. Cool McCool wasn't just clumsy. His missions were filled with constant explosions, gunfire, kidnappings, and bizarre villains straight out of pulp comics. Instead of subtle humor, the show leaned into grotesque character designs and slapstick violence. Entire cities would be endangered because McCool couldn't keep his gadgets from backfiring. And the villains? Each was exaggerated to the point of nightmare fuel. You had characters with steel jaws, sinister laughs, and designs that felt more disturbing than funny. For kids in the 1960s, this was high camp. For today's standards, it's over-the-top violence wrapped in unsettling visuals. There's another reason it wouldn't air now: tone. The parody sometimes blurred the line between satire and straight-up chaos. Was McCool mocking spies or glamorizing reckless danger? The message was muddy, and modern watchdogs would jump on that immediately. Cool McCool ended after a short run, but it remains a wild relic. In today's environment of parental scrutiny, it's exactly the kind of cartoon that would get banned for being too violent, too weird, and far too messy for Saturday morning. Snuffy Smith and Barney Google, 1962 to 63. This one started as a comic strip, then leapt into animation in the early 60s. Snuffy Smith and Barney Google centered around rural, hillbilly characters, with Snuffy portrayed as a lazy, scheming backwoodsman who dodged work, drank questionable homemade brew, and schemed his way through life. Yes, this was pitched as kids' entertainment. The cartoon leaned heavily into stereotypes of poor rural communities, thick accents, moonshine jokes, and caricatures of simple folk trying to outwit each other were the backbone of the humor. At the time, audiences laughed along. Today, it would trigger instant backlash for mocking entire groups of people based on where they live and how they speak. Add to that the recurring theme of dishonesty. Snuffy's antics weren't about teaching lessons or good values. He usually tricked his way into success while ridiculing anyone who worked hard. For a cartoon aimed at children, that's a dangerous message. The series only lasted a year, but its reputation is more as a curiosity than a classic. Looking back, Snuffy Smith and Barney Google is a reminder that sometimes cartoons leaned on stereotypes as a crutch, with little thought to how it came across. And in 2025, it's the kind of show that would get banned before the first episode hit the air. Milton the Monster, 1965 to 66. Finally, we come to Milton the Monster, a supposed parody of Frankenstein that leaned into horror tropes for laughs. Milton was created in a bubbling cauldron with essence of terror, tincture of tenderness, and other bizarre ingredients that made him a goofy, bumbling monster. The show mixed mad scientist cliches with slapstick, trying to balance scary visuals with comedy. But here's the thing. The funny horror concept often tipped too far into straight-up creepy. Episodes featured graveyards, monsters, potions, and dark laboratories, all wrapped in a kid's cartoon. Milton himself was lovable, but the surrounding characters and imagery leaned into unsettling territory. For 1960s children, this was daring and fun. For today's parents, it would be a no-go. The show also featured other shorts with equally bizarre or violent humor, like Fearless Fly, where a mild-mannered insect became a superhero after putting on special glasses. The tone was never soft. It was loud, chaotic, and often unsettling. Milton the Monster might still hold nostalgic charm, but in the modern era of carefully policed children's programming, it's exactly the type of cartoon that would be banned for being too dark, too weird, and too inappropriate for young viewers. The 1960s gave us wild, experimental cartoons, some brilliant, some baffling, and some that make you wonder how they ever got on TV. From pill-popping heroes to presidents with superpowers, these shows reflect an era where rules didn't really exist. But would they survive today? Not a chance. Which of these would shock you the most if it aired now? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and get ready, because the past has plenty more cartoon chaos to uncover.